Good evening and welcome to the Vail Symposium's program, The 10 Greatest Photographs of All Time. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Over the last several days and truly weeks, I have heard a lot of speculation about what the top photographs could possibly be and how they could possibly be selected. And indeed, there are many possible approaches, from the quality of the photograph itself to the context in which the photograph was taken and the impact it has had. We are fortunate this evening to have our exploration guided by Clay Jenkinson, who has not only explored photography himself as a once aspiring photojournalist, but who is a renowned humanities scholar. Clay will give us a humanities lens on the importance of these photographs and their place in history. And we will also have time for conversation around several of the photographs you have suggested, both here in our live audience on the clipboards in the back, and we will also give that opportunity to our live stream audience as well. Clay will soon be embarking on his Listening to America tour, and you can find his weekly podcasts and follow his journey at ltamerica.org. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Clay Jenkinson.
Well, good evening, everyone, and to those who are streaming in from all over the country, thank you for giving your time to this program. I'm thrilled to be here. I love coming to Vail, in part because I'm a North Dakotan, it's always nice to go uphill into one of the most beautiful places on earth. I do invite you to come to North Dakota, also beautiful, but not as high. In several senses of the term, I should say, when per medical marijuana will be number 49 or 50, I can promise you that. But I love coming here, and so I want to start by a disclaimer. The 10 greatest photographs, what a ludicrous and insane thing to say. The 10 greatest paintings of all time, the 10 greatest songs of all time, the 10 greatest books of all time. There's no sense in something like that because it's arbitrary. These are 10 photographs that I chose out of several hundred that I love, but the backstory on these is really, the backstories on these photographs are really interesting to me, and I think to you too. And when I designed this lecture, I said to my friends here at the Vail Symposium, let's have an interactive period where people can sort of nominate a photograph, and if it's one of yours, we'll put it up, and during the Q&A period, you can also ask any question you want on any subject. I'll start this way. When I was 14 years old, in 1969, living in a small cattle town in western North Dakota, my parents gave me the greatest gift of my lifetime at Christmas, and it was a Canon 35 millimeter camera. How many of you have used a 35 millimeter camera? For those at home, it's everybody. How many of you have used an old Kodak camera, the Instamatic? How many of you have used a Brownie camera? So, for those at home, almost everybody. And so I still have the first photographs I took that Christmas day. And it changed my life. It changed the entire trajectory of my life. And I was a photographer for my student newspapers and the yearbook and so on. But when my family had some difficulties when I was 15 years old. I went to work for this local newspaper called the Jenkinson Press, circulation 6,000. And within weeks, I was the chief photographer. So you can understand how pathetic the Jenkinson Press was. And I was a sports reporter, and I worked in the darkroom. I was the darkroom manager. I got to run the presses one summer. It was a wonderful apprenticeship. And also to see the revolution, the transition between hot lead type to offset. So I've had a really fortunate life, and my plan was to be a photojournalist. I thought I would wander the country and take photographs of extraordinary moments and place them in the Associated Press. And in some sense, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be traveling the country for the next 5 years in an Airstream. And I used to think I'd have a darkroom in my RV, not required anymore, is it? And I used to think I would carry 200 books. I'll carry 400 books, but they'll be mostly in an iPad. So the technology has made this sort of thing a little bit easier. So I just want to start with that disclaimer, and I'm going to go through these. And again, there's an arbitrariness to this, but I want, when I ask you, I'll say, how many of you would have chosen this as one of your 10? And please just raise your hand. So, there are many different categories here. You could do this, the greatest sports photographs of all time, the greatest war photographs, the greatest wildlife, the greatest technology, fashion, portraits, etc. So it's a very big field. This is the Jenkinson press, by the way, a little before my time. I took this photograph the first summer with my 35 millimeter camera. That's Neil Armstrong. We had, that round hot tube television. I set the camera up on a tripod. My sister thought it was the most insane possible imposition, but everyone has such an older sister. And I took 100 photographs of the screen. Remember that we didn't have any way of recording these things, so if you missed it, you missed it. Anyway, and then you see I put it in this little spiral bound book with my 14-year-old handwriting, as if no one would get this without that label. And then I was asked, the Christian Science Monitor called the Jenkinson Press and said, we're doing a dying town story. And of course, North Dakota is a famous dying town story place. Whenever the New York Times wants to do a dying town story, they come to North Dakota, and we serve one up. We've got hundreds. And they said, would your chief photographer go out and take a photograph that could illustrate? And they didn't know there was just this kid who had to be pulled out of high school to do it. And I went to Belfield, North Dakota, and I took this photograph through this window. We sent off 50 photographs, and they printed it. And I was 15, and I'm now published in the Christian Science Monitor. I don't know if you know this, they used to print this on paper. I know you still do here in the Valley. And so this was one of the proudest moments of my life, and I thought, here I go. It won't be long before, I'm in war zones around the world. This is not mine. Some of you will recognize this. This is the first known photograph. The technology was primitive. That's France, 1826. Here it is cleaned up a little from a window in Le Gras on a kind of tin type. And that is the first photograph. Here is the first photograph with a human being in it, 1845. So we've come a long way, haven't we? We've moved from daguerreotype to a wet plate collodion process, and then to dry glass plates, and then to the beginning of film and emulsion. And when I was growing up, 35 millimeter was the state of the art, Tri-X and Plus X and Kodachrome and so on. Now you have to really scramble to get a roll of film. And with the coming of digital photography, we gained and lost, I think. We've lost something important. One thing is that some of the photographs that we're seeing were taken, and if the photographer couldn't do what we would do, was take 100 pictures in 3 minutes, that photographer had to take 1 or 2, especially if it's an action photograph. And so it completely changes the way we think about it, in sort of the Marshall McLuhan sense that the medium is the message. So with that sort of introduction, let me start. So my 10, not universal 10, but here's one. How many would have chosen Napalm Girl? And I'm sorry, these are really hard photographs to look at. This is one of the most disturbing photographs of my lifetime. This is a Napalm Girl. The photograph was taken by this man, Nick Ut, still alive, born in 1951, taken for the Associated Press. This woman is still alive. She lives in Toronto. She survived, and he helped her survive. This is an incident in which the South Vietnamese Air Force directed by the United States military, napalmed a village in South Vietnam. The people fled. Let's go back to the photograph. Her clothes burned off of her body. She was burned over 70% of her body. He took her. Photojournalists try not to intervene, but he was so appalled that he took her to the hospital, and the people at the hospital said, "She can't live, there's nothing we can do for her." But she did live. And she now lives in Toronto. And here she is, on the left, with Nick Ut. They're friends. And they talk on the telephone on average once a week. She has 2 children. She has a human rights organization. She's immensely resilient and forgiving. Here she is again. That's something, isn't that a great story of human resilience? And you can see she's had multiple surgeries, of course, and you can see that she bears the scars to this day. But this is a photograph that changed America's attitude towards the war. 1972, the New York Times had a long debate about whether to print it. Not because it's so disturbing, but because they had a policy of never printing photographs of naked people. But they rightly decided that this was too important a photograph to pass up. Amazing, isn't it? The backstory makes it so much more interesting. And if you had to choose one, and there are hundreds of great photographs from the Vietnam conflict, but if you had to choose one, it would almost certainly be this one. But we also have the photograph of the Buddhist immolating himself, pouring kerosene and lighting it. That was 1963, before our involvement got large. And then there's the photograph of the execution on the streets of Saigon of a Viet Cong suspect. All right. Number 2, the dying soldier. How many of you would have chosen this? Well, I guess I'm alone. For those 1 or 2, for those at home, this is a photograph of the Spanish Civil War, and it was taken by one of the great war photographers in history, a man named Capa, Robert Capa, and this is a freedom fighter who's just been killed, and he's falling backwards. There's a certain graininess to this. It became an internationally famous photograph. There is some controversy about it, as there is for most of these photographs. He was later accused of staging this. Not true. But the dates and the location don't really line up quite right, and so there is some concern about this. But this is Robert Capa here, died in 1954. He was one of those dashing photojournalists who traveled the world, and these are 2 wonderful photographs of him. This is another one of his. It's not in my top 10, but you've seen this photograph. This is one of the most iconic D-Day photographs, which he took. And if you saw Saving Private Ryan, you know that the attempt was made to make the first 20 minutes of that film have this kind of a feel, this kind of a grainy, black and white, uncertainty, we'd say pixelated, but out of focus feel. But this became another one of the photographs that went viral during the landings in 1944. Here he is with John Steinbeck. They went to the Soviet Union in the 1950s, and they were good friends, and they toured the Soviet Union. The Soviets did not allow Capa to take many photographs, and the ones that he took were heavily supervised and censored. But there's a book by John Steinbeck called A Russian Journal, which I recommend. And he was a brave man, Steinbeck. He went to the Soviet Union in the 1950s, so shortly after the war. He wanted to see for himself both the devastations at Stalingrad and Moscow, but also to see how the average people of Russia were living at that time. He went to Georgia, he went to Ukraine, he went to a number of places in the Soviet Union. interestingly enough, Steinbeck, as an old man, went to Vietnam just 3 years before his death, and he spent 5 full months in Vietnam. And he went out with patrols. He went out in helicopters and was landed in places. He was in a siege at one of the hills. One of his sons was involved in the war at that time. So Kappa and Steinbeck were close. So number 3, the roaring lion. How many of you would have chosen this? About a handful. So I love this photograph, and I'll tell you why. The backstory makes the photograph. So this was taken in Ottawa, in Canada. I just lightened this up so you can get a little bit of sense of detail. Here you have the scowling Winston Churchill. And it became almost the most iconic photograph ever taken of Winston Churchill. Here he is with his cigar, of course, looking a little more cheerful, I think. Photograph was taken by Yusuf Karsh. Churchill had given a speech to the Parliament of Canada. This photo opportunity was not on his schedule, and so he was angry because he was in a hurry and he was tired and he didn't want to sit for a photo session, so he gave Yusuf Karsh 2 minutes. And Karsh in 2 minutes had to take a photograph of the great man. When he sat him down, Churchill smoked his famous cigar. And Karsh said to him, "No, that will distract. That will distract from the intentions of my photograph." And Churchill said, "Tough. Take it or leave it." And so back to the photograph. He had a remote on a cord. Remember when the remote shutter was on a cord? He got the camera entirely set up, got Churchill situated, made sure the focus was right, that he did with the light meters and everything. And then just before he pushed the frame, he snatched that cigar out of Churchill's mouth. And he said, "Forgive me, sir." And that's why Churchill is scowling, because his body sovereignty was invaded by who's this photographer. And so this sort of accident led to one of the greatest photographs. Amazing, isn't it? This is how he wanted to look, more or less. Think of how fortunate we are. This says determination, I think. This says, we're going to get through this. But this one says determination. So here's Yusuf Karsh, died in 2002. Here he is again. Here's what he said. He was in no mood for portraiture, and 2 minutes were all that he would allow me as he passed from the House of Commons chamber to an anteroom. 2 niggardly minutes in which I must try to put on film a man who had already written or inspired a library of books, baffled all his biographers, filled the world with his fame, and me on this occasion with dread. I can imagine. Churchill's cigar was ever present. I held out an ashtray, but he would not dispose of it. I went back to my camera and made sure that everything was all right. Technically, I waited. He continued to chomp vigorously on his cigar. I waited, then I stepped toward him, and without premeditation, but ever so respectfully, I said, "Forgive me, sir," and plucked the cigar out of his mouth. By the time I got back to my camera, he looked so belligerent that he could have devoured me. It was at that instant that I took the photograph. Think of it, just how marvelous this is. It's a great photograph in and of itself, but the story about it just deepens and creates, I think, pure delight in us. All right, so we're moving along. Number 4. How many would have chosen this photograph? So about a little over half here. This is an amazing story. This photograph was taken by a photographer who has never been identified on September 20th, 1932, on the 69th floor of the RCA building in New York at 30 Rock. This was taken as a publicity photograph to advertise this great new skyscraper and the compound at Rockefeller Center. These are 11 immigrants. They're actual workers. They're not body doubles or paid actors. And they asked them if they would be willing to go have lunch on this girder. They're not tethered to the girder. There's no safety net. Would you do it? 850 feet above the streets of Manhattan. Amazingly, we don't know who the photographer was. Attempts were immediately made to have someone to identify him come forward so that we can honor you. And even more amazingly, only 3 of the 11 have ever been identified. And of course, it's been out since the next day. It's one of the most reproduced photographs in the world, and yet we have never been able to identify, in spite of enormous efforts, who they are. Here are the 3 we know. Joseph Echner, third from the left, Joseph Curtis, third from the right, and Gustav, probably, but not certainly, Gustav Popovich with the bottle. I get nervous looking at the photograph. Almost nothing in the world would make me do this, and certainly nothing would make me do it with 10 other guys. Because if somebody sneezes, it's the Keystone Cops with a lot of death. Then they came off, everyone was fine. Then one person lay down on it, on his back, and then 2 of them threw a football back and forth for a while. This is Houdini stuff. This is Evel Knievel stuff. But there it is. With almost every one of these photographs, there's a documentary film. So if you Google this, you can get a full account of the search for the people in it and so on. Here's the documentary, Men at Lunch. If my grandfather had been in that photograph, I would come forward to say, that's visual, so we should be able to identify people, facial recognition or something, but no. Number 5, of course, how many would have chosen Migrant Mother? This is 1936 in California, taken by the great Dorothea Lange. She was working for the Resettlement Administration, so she was a paid government photographer. She was traveling back to her home in Los Angeles, and she was on a road just north of Los Angeles, and she saw this sign on the side of the road, a rickety little sign saying Pea Picker Camp, and drove on. And then she thought, I think I should go take a look at that camp. So she turned her car around, and she came in and she found this woman. Her name is Florence Thompson, and she asked her if she asked politely if she could take her photograph, and she did. And this became almost the most iconic photograph of the Great Depression and the Okies and the Dust Bowl and the world that Steinbeck described in The Grapes of Wrath. But there's more to this story. So she didn't just take a snapshot. She posed this photograph. She asked this woman if she could take it, but she also asked her if she could turn her children's heads back because she wanted to feature Florence Thompson's face. She didn't want to have the whole family because she thought that would dilute it, and I think she's absolutely right. There were 3 children, 4 actually, the baby and then 3 children. You'll see one more. And this is the photograph that became iconic. As you probably know, recently, because of the extraordinary developments in photographic technology, lots of photographs are being colorized. And here's the colorized version. I think that it has to be black and white, don't you? I mean, it loses something in color. When I see like a Humphrey Bogart film, I think the world was black and white then. But you realize, of course, this is how she actually looked on the right, but it loses something both in its impact, but also in its sort of verisimilitude for the era in which it was taken. There was color photography in 1936, but it was still a relatively rare thing. This was only one of the shots. Here's another one. And so the children have not been cleaned up for this photograph. She's breastfeeding the one who's in her lap, and here's a colorized version of that. You see she's sitting on a packing crate in a makeshift tent in this squatters village, pea picker camp, a few dozen miles north of Los Angeles. Here's another version of it. Here's the first photograph. That's the teenager on the rocking chair. That's a great photograph. But it's not that photograph, is it? So something, I've been working on a whole series of projects about Edward S. Curtis, and if we have time, I'll show you an Edward S. Curtis photograph. He was the one who took the amazing photographs of Native Americans between 1905 and 1930. He produced 20 volumes called The North American Indian of Ethnography, and some of the greatest photographs ever taken of American Indians. And there's a magic in them. If you've ever looked at his photographs of Red Cloud or of Chief Joseph or of Geronimo or just sort of average individuals of the Lakota, of the Shoshone, of the Nez Perce, of the Clatsop, and so on. I have to try to articulate this. It's not easy. If you gave me $1 million and the finest photographic equipment in the world and said, go take pictures of Native Americans, I would do it, of course. And if you have $1 million, I could use it for this. But I could never do what Curtis did. Something happened. There's often a very significant language barrier for him because he doesn't speak Lakota or Crow. But somehow, some magical thing occurred where these natives gave themselves. I shall speak loud, but the people who are at home will never forgive us. So Curtis was some transaction of trust or of artistry or of deep intuition occurred, and the portraits are become world-class and unforgettable, as this one is. Imagine if her hand were down on her lap. Imagine if she were looking directly into the camera. Dorothea Lange didn't say, look away from the camera. She just took this photograph, although she did stage it a little. She also photoshopped it. I don't have a pointer, but the woman's thumb was sort of sticking out by the bundle of her infant, and so she used primitive techniques of the time to remove that because it distracted from the quality of the photograph. But there's a magic to this. A photographer clicks a button, of course, and does some really interesting work in a darkroom. But a photographer who has gifts like this is able to draw something out that most of us couldn't. And so the difference between a really good photograph and a great photograph, I think, is illustrated here. That's a good photograph, but it wouldn't become the iconic photograph of the 1930s. I love this photograph too. And here are a few of them together. This is Dorothea Lange. Look at her cool shoes. Sitting on top of her car with a portable camera. What a great gig she had. And she and Steinbeck became friends, so Steinbeck is sort of a through line on some of this. And Life magazine asked Steinbeck to team up with her and to go into the Central Valley of California and write a series of articles about the plight of the refugees, the Okies. And she was to take the photographs, and she did take photographs. He wrote an account of what he saw, and it was so gripping and so sad that Life refused to print the article. So what did he do instead? Wrote one of the greatest books of the 20th century, The Grapes of Wrath. Number 6. How many would choose Ali be listed? So I wanted to have at least one sports photograph. This is regarded by some as the greatest sports photograph ever taken. There's a long series of honorable mentions, This is 1965 against Sonny Liston in Lewiston, Maine. The photograph was taken by Neil Leifer. This sort of set in the American mind our idea who young Muhammad Ali was. He was still making the transition from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali at this time. And I don't know if you remember this, but white America was not fond of him at this time. He became kind of a world hero towards the end of his life, but there was a great deal of anti-Muhammad Ali feeling in the country. I remember seeing newscasters with him and saying, "I will never call you Muhammad Ali. You are Cassius Clay, and I don't know why you should demand to be called something else." The country wasn't fond of black Muslims. The country wasn't fond of what it would have called uppity African-American males. And so this scowl, this triumph, is one of the things that helped to create the Muhammad Ali legend. As you probably know if you're a sports fan, this was widely thought to be a faked fight, that Sonny Liston took a dive and that he had been paid to be knocked out in the first round. Ali denied that for the rest of his life, but it involved something that was called the phantom punch, because when they looked at the footage, they couldn't see that he had really hit Sonny Liston in a way that would knock out a great boxer like that. Here's another photograph. Oh, here's Mr. Leifer, Neil Leifer, with Muhammad Ali much later. I love that. It's a really sweet photograph, isn't it? The elderly, somewhat palsied Muhammad Ali. If you haven't seen Ken Burns' documentary on Muhammad Ali, I just so urge you to do so. It's one of the best things that he's ever done. It came out about 6 or 7 years ago. It's gripping and terrifying and saddening, and yet it's such a monument to this man. You know, he had the courage to become a black Muslim when his country was not willing to permit that. He had the courage to refuse to be inducted into the United States Army. Because of that, his title was stripped. He was banned from boxing during the prime years of his athleticism. Eventually, the Supreme Court dropped it, and then he won the championship of the world twice more. Here's another photograph taken the same day. In some ways, I like this one better, but that's not the one that became iconic. This was the one that traveled through the Associated Press, distributed the next day. You see the difference in the way that his arms are. Interesting, isn't it? How many like this one better? How many like the black and white one better? About half and half, I'd say here. I love this photograph, and it has that kind of gritty boxing kind of feel to it, which is part of its, I won't say charm, but part of its potency. And here's another from that same moment. This is how we sort of remember him. Or how about this? That's the Muhammad Ali that we all remember, the mouth. But okay, so it's easy to almost caricature him. He was a caricature in some ways. But I want you to look at this next photograph. It's not on my list, but the athleticism of this man, because his genius was that he knew how not to get hit in the head. Eventually, he was hit 100 or 500 times too often, and it destroyed him. But look at this photograph. When you go home, try bending back like that for a while, with George Fraser trying to kill you. That is an extraordinary photograph, perfectly balanced in the way that, the ringside people can't compose these photographs. They're just trying to get something. You see the man on the lower right trying to take a picture from the other side. That is an amazing moment of athletic grace in a brutal sport, boxing. All right, number 7. Salvador Dali's photograph. Philippe Halsman's photograph of Salvador Dali. You've seen Dali paintings, of course, and posters. So he's surreal and absurdist and things, clocks that melt and all of that. So Philippe Halsman, who was an extraordinary photographer, wanted to take a picture of dolly that would somehow embody Dolly's vision of life. And so this was taken in a studio. The chair was held up by an aide. The easel was on a wire that was later sort of dodged out in the period form of Photoshop. The painting, which is, it's called Dolly Atomicus, is also held up, and that chair is lifted off, that bench is lifted off the ground. The cats are real. No cats were injured in this photograph. And the water was thrown every time. And you don't get this right on the first try. 28 takes. So 28 times, his wife Yvonne and his daughter Irene and several others were there, and then he would have the camera all set up and he would say, all right, on 3. And on 3, his daughter would throw the bucket of water. The cats were tossed. They're not on wires, the cats were tossed. They formed a union shortly thereafter. And then it didn't, and after each take, he went into the darkroom and developed the negative to see if it worked. And it took 28 tries, and a whole ordeal of a day. And when he was in the darkroom, his family had to clean up. You know, wipe the floor, get more water, put more Valium in the cats. Somebody said to me earlier today, I hope the room was closed because those cats would be long gone after the second take. But how many of you think that this is animal cruelty? Nobody here, but I'll bet there were people that did not like doing this to these cats. Let me just show you a little more. So this is 1948, Philippe Halsman. Here he is. Look at that camera. Amazing. I love these portraits of these photographers, 1906 to 1979. Here you can see poor Yvonne with her mop on the right. There was a toaster in it at one time, you can see in the middle. What can go wrong with a toaster and water and a cat, you know? And here is the unretouched version where you can see someone holding the chair. Poor Dolly had to jump every time, which he was all too willing to do. Here are some of the takes on this amazing photograph. So Dolly was one of Philippe Halsman's subjects. And if you can imagine, maybe some of you know this, but Philippe Halsman was a genius, and he decided to create something called the jump book. Have you heard of the jump book? So here's his theory, that if you have Winston Churchill or Muhammad Ali or Bill Clinton or anybody pose, they're gonna prepare a face for the portrait. But he said when you jump, there's no way you can try to look good, you're just jumping. And so he thought if you have people jump, you'll reveal their actual character. And so he decided to do this with as many people as he could talk into this. And it's amazing, you're gonna see some of the people, I only have a few, but there's a jump book that you can purchase online or in your local bookstore. I'm all for independent bookstores. The Bookworm is amazing, you're so fortunate to have it. And the jump book has over 100 of these portraits. So here are a couple. This was the height of Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin before their breakup. And it epitomizes them, I think. This was not a jump book photograph, but I love this. Philippe Halsman, this is after the birds, of course, of Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, what an amazing photograph. Here's his photograph of Einstein, which is maybe the iconic photograph of Albert Einstein. Here, you know who these are? The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the former King of England and Mrs. Simpson removed their shoes and agreed to jump for Philippe Halsman. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. Here's Marilyn Monroe. Isn't that great? There's a surprise. Richard Milhous Nixon jumped kept his shoes on. And he looks a little grim, but he did it. Halsman must have had some incredible persuasive power to get these people to do this. And once he, if you get Nixon, you can almost get anybody after that. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Laugh-In. Nixon was trying to prove that he was groovy. There's an impossible task. And he was on Laugh-In, and then when they would open the little different gates and people would be their faces and so on, and they opened the gate and he says, "Sock it to me?" It just didn't come off as fully groovy. This is J. Robert Oppenheimer. And this is how I discovered the Jump book, because this was the cover photograph of a recent biography of Oppenheimer. This epitomizes him. He weighed almost nothing. He was tall and lean and wore the highest quality clothing. And there was a kind of a self-containedness to it, an elegance to him. But he was also toying with black holes and worms and the very stuff of the cosmos. And so to see him pointing up to the Empyrean, up to the heavens, with a chalkboard and formulae behind him in what's obviously a classroom, is as good a portrait of Oppenheimer as we could possibly get. And there are dozens more, so either order the book, The Jump Book by Philippe Halsman, or just go online. Most of the photographs are there, and they're in pretty high resolution. So, just to go back, this is the photograph that I think is, it's an amazing photograph. I don't know, does it really qualify as one of the 10 greatest photographs? No, but it's one of the 10 most interesting photographs of an amazing surrealist painter by an even more amazing photographer. I mean, this photograph, you don't just take a snapshot like that. There's a magic in the greatest photographers. All right, number 8. The inevitable VJ day. How many would have chosen this? So, a little 2/3. You're probably reading about the controversy now surrounding this photograph. It was taken by Alfred Eisenstadt, who was a great Prussian-born photographer. In fact, Eisenstadt put 92 covers on Life magazine. Think of that. Life magazine was a weekly. 92 times Life featured a cover photograph taken by this extraordinary photographer, Alfred Eisenstadt. This is VJ Day, so it's August 14th, 1945. It's Times Square. These are two strangers never identified. I'll come back to that. They do not know each other. This sailor, filled with relief and ecstasy, grabbed this nurse, bent her over in a kind of Hollywood style, and kissed her. As soon as it was published the next day, the New York Times and Life said, "Identify yourselves." Nobody came forward. But now, in the years since, this probably changes now, but in the years since, at least 6 women said they were the nurse. And more than 20 men. So, because their faces are obscured, you want in on fame, you make this claim. But as you probably know, it's sort of been canceled. Beginning around 2010, the allegation was that this was a form of sexual assault, unwanted sexual attention. And people demanded that we cease to honor this extremely widely reproduced photograph. And just like the last couple of weeks, the United States military has wrestled back and forth. Cancel, don't cancel, cancel, don't cancel. But they've decided to keep it for now. And I want to talk about this carefully. So, of course, we now are extremely sensitive to unwanted sexual attention. Of course, we should be. And today, we would find something like this probably intolerable. But it is sort of important to remember that this was VJ Day, when the most devastating war in history had just come to an end, and this man probably wasn't going to Okinawa or going to the mainland of China for the invasion that was prevented by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People do this sort of thing on occasions like this. They grab somebody and kiss them, they hug, or this is a spontaneous human expression of relief and joy, but also the pent-up anxieties and fear and concern. So, yes, I get it. You get it too, of course. But don't you sigh a little to think, oh God, is there nothing anymore that doesn't trigger some... On a Tuesday, I'm on the side of canceling, and on a Wednesday, I'm on the side of not canceling, and I think we're all kind of balled up here. But it is a great photograph. Eisenstadt, things were happening very fast in Times Square, and so he tried to find these two to identify them, which is what a photojournalist does, but they had disappeared, not together, in the crowd. And recently it has been alleged, and I haven't seen the other image, but that there's a second image in which she's kind of socking him in the shoulder. That could be playful, or it could be outraged. We don't know. We don't know what her reaction was. Well, I'm guessing she did not consider filing a lawsuit or, and so on. It was a really, 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 really extraordinary moment in history. And here is Eisenstadt, a beautiful picture of him. He also took these. Man, of course we love photographs of Marilyn Monroe, but look at those two photographs. Again, the gift of this man and her gifts, her capacity to, whatever you want to call that look. That kind of sultry, sad, seductive, incredibly beautiful image. This is his photograph of Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer, which is also a magnificent photograph because they're studying. I'm sure he posed this to a certain degree, but it's one of the great photographs of Oppenheimer and a very good photograph of his sort of sometime friend and colleague. And you can see the energy level of Eisenstadt. This was taken, by the way, by Philippe Holzman. So they're all connecting up here. Number 9. Oh, how many say that this has to be there, right? This is raising the flag at Iwo Jima. Many interesting things about this. Number 1, it's been accused of being staged, and maybe it partly was. Number 2, if you can imagine it, it took almost 40 years to identify all the individuals in it. You would have thought that every one of them would be self-identified, but not so. This is Joe Rosenthal for the Associated Press, and here's the island of Iwo Jima. What do you notice about it? Nobody lives there. So we took 70,000 US Marines to invade this island, which was being defended by 18,000 Japanese soldiers. In the 6 days of this battle, there were more than 20,000 US casualties, 7,000 some dead, and the rest wounded, sometimes grievously. So 20,000 US casualties, and of the 18,000 Japanese soldiers, only 246 were captured, and the rest were killed. It's one of the bloodiest battles in human history. For this is not Tokyo. This is not Berlin. This is not a fortress or a military depot. This is an uninhabited island that the US and the Allies felt was essential in their island hopping so that they could get to the mainland. It reminds me a little of this passage from Hamlet where he's talking about this sort of phenomenon. He says, "I see the imminent death of 20,000 men that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot wherein the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain." Amazing insight by Shakespeare that war can be this pointless, or was it? Maybe it was essential to the winning of the war, but it wasn't for some glittering capital like Kyoto or the actual capital of Japan, Tokyo. it's one of the great, severe, really problematic moments in the Pacific War. But there it is. Here's Joe Rosenthal, late in life. And here's the sadness of this. Well, first, a great story. He took this photograph. Now today, if you took this photograph, you'd have it on an SD card, and then you would find a hotspot, or a satellite today, a photojournalist would have, and that would be immediately transmitted to New York City, where it would be immediately promulgated, distributed, both in print and in the cyberspace. He took the photograph, he gave it to somebody who then got it to a US command post, where it was transmitted using extremely low-tech kind of fax technology. Think of it, these are vacuum tubes, to New York. It was printed within 17 hours of its being taken. That's instantaneous. Think of it, it had to cross the world, and it had to be developed first. It had to be, that was developed, he didn't develop it, he handed it off. It was developed in an Army photo depot somewhere in the Pacific or on a ship. Then it is transmitted, and at the Jenkinson Press, we had a version of this even in the 1970s, when you would send a photograph, the AP would send us a photograph, say of My Lai or something, and there was this machine, and it would be in the newsroom, and it printed on a blue plastic technology, and you'd hear the newsroom go, for an hour to get one photograph, grainy and almost illegible, and that was high tech. So think of what it took to do this. It's heroic. He was embittered because he was accused for 50 years of staging the photograph. He didn't, but he also said, would you pause a little and hold, and so I can get this and move around and get the right angle. But he was accused of having staged it, and it broke his heart because he won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's one of the great photographs of all time. These are the men. They finally were identified. Here's of course, the famous statue group at Arlington National Cemetery. How many of you have seen this? Very, very powerful. It's outside. Yeah, just outside. And here's the photograph that came before by another photographer, same hill, earlier in the day, raising a different flag. Both of those flags have been preserved and are in a war museum. And this was by a Marine Corps photographer by the name of Lewis Lowry. All right, number 10, Earthrise. How many would have chosen Earthrise? You sort of have to choose this one because, it's Earthrise. This one had more influence than most photographs have ever had. It was on the cover of the whole Earth catalog. It helped to generate the first Earth Day. It's credited with helping to create the environmental movement in the 1970s. And it was an accident. This was Apollo 8 in December of 1968. How many of you remember the Genesis moment when they read the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis in lunar orbit? Oh, you've got to look this up. It is so interesting. I just taught an online course called Religion and the Space Program. And Apollo 8 in December of 1968, the first to carry astronauts in the Apollo program. Remember, Apollo 1 had a fire on the ground, and 3 astronauts had been killed, and it almost destroyed the space program. There wasn't another serious manned flight until for a year and a half later, in December of 1968, and they went all the way to the moon. They didn't land. And on December 24th, just before they ended a little television broadcast, a live broadcast from the moon, Frank Borman said, it's Christmas Eve, we'd just like to close in this way. And then each of the 3 read a couple of verses from the first 10 verses of Genesis. I remember sitting in my parents' same living room that you saw earlier, and my father was an atheist, but by the time this was over, their tears were coursing down his cheeks because it was so moving. It wasn't Christian particularly, it wasn't Judeo-Christian, and there's a long, fascinating story of how Frank Borman came to this. It wasn't easy, but it was Borman, not NASA, that set this up. But they were so heavily engineered, and the timeline was to the second on things that they were to do, And Borman, who just died, by the way, just a few months ago in Montana, Borman was a kind of, excuse my term, a hard-ass commander, and he kept telling them, don't take any pictures, it's not on the script. Just, we're only doing what's on the script. He didn't want to do any of the television broadcasts. He tried to prevent NASA from sending this crude video camera. But they didn't expect to take an Earthrise photo. They didn't know what an Earthrise would look like. And they came around on one of their orbits and they saw this. And Borman said, get a picture of this. And the other two said, hey, I thought we weren't supposed to take a picture. It's not on the script. So this was taken. So this is William Anders, who was one of the 3 astronauts. I'll show you him in a minute. Apollo 8. Here he is, looking very crew cut. There they are. Borman on the left, Anders in the center, and Jim Lovell, the famous Jim Lovell of Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem, Jim Lovell on the right. This is the actual photograph. But NASA said, no, the Earth can't rise sideways. So they reoriented it. But this is the famous photograph. And it's not as good, is it? You know, it's got to be this. This has been, you see that NASA touched it up a little to heighten the blue and so on, but this is the actual photograph. I don't think it would have been as iconic in this orientation. You remember Madeleine Murray O'Hare, the sort of America's super atheist? She's the one in 1962 who got prayer removed from U.S. schools. She's the one who filed the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in the Engels decision said that you cannot require school prayer because that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. For this, she became known universally, and Life magazine had a 12-page story about her, the most hated woman in America. She was a very strange woman, and there's a really interesting biography of her. She faked her own death at one point, and so on and so forth. But and here she is with Johnny Carson. You know, he thought of himself as kind of an intellectual at times, and so he'd have Carl Sagan on and others. So he had Madeleine Murray O'Hare on, and he's earnestly asking her, you know, how do you feel being the most hated woman in America? She filed suit against NASA after the Genesis moment in 1968, and said this is a clear violation of the separation of church and state. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court dismissed it. And then the U.S. Postal Service, to sort of rub it in a little, printed a version of Earthrise with this verse, the first 4 words in English of the book of Genesis. She wanted a petition campaign to express discontentment with that Genesis moment. 30,000 people joined the petition. But there was a counter set of petitions, and 3 million endorsements of the Genesis moment came to NASA. The country said, basically, yeah, we get church and state, but that was okay. That was okay. We're not going to go to the wall on this one. I don't know if you know this, but when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, this is Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the first thing you do when you land on the moon, and you realize how hard that is because a few weeks ago, the lander tipped. If their lander had tipped, they would never have come back. There's no way you recover from that. There's no jack you can get out and put that thing back up. And remember the Japanese one a few months ago. Poor Japanese, their first great moon landing, it landed well and then fell on its head. When Apollo 11 occurred and Armstrong and Aldrin were safely on the moon, then the first thing you do is do a checklist in case you have to leave right away. And as soon as they got that done, Buzz Aldrin turned to Neil Armstrong and said, I wonder if you would allow me to do something. And Buzz Aldrin took communion on the moon. Think of this. He had this, he's an Episcopalian, he had the wine consecrated in Houston. He had a tiny little wafer. He had a tiny little vial of wine. He had a verse that he had printed out. Neil Armstrong was sort of like, not sure this is a great idea. Aldrin had vetted this with NASA. They said, do it, but do not announce it. Do not say anything because Madeleine Murray O'Hare is after us. And so you can see this. There are some very great film versions of this. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I just want everyone back home on Earth to pause for a moment and to give thanks to whomever you give thanks to at this really extraordinary moment in human history. He was taking communion. It wasn't known until years later. We still have the chalice. There are photographs. It's amazing. And so this course I taught was on religion in the space program, and it gets even more interesting than all of that. But think of it. You can only land on the moon by a triumph of secular science and Newtonian mechanics. Because the Earth is spinning, and then you send a Volkswagen-sized thing 250,000 miles to another spinning thing. It sounds easy, doesn't it? It's an enormous triumph of Newtonian mechanics to be able to do that. And now we see how hard it is, because even infinitely greater computing and infinitely greater rocketry in our time can't do it. Not always, anyway. And so here's a triumph of Newtonian mechanics, and then there's this sacrament that has deep, fundamental mystery at its core. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating paradox and a lovely one. Here's Borman's picture. He took the first one. And it's great, but it was in black and white. And then Anders, who was the official photographer of Apollo 7, said, look, Frank, give me the camera. It's a Hasselblad. And then he took off the back and put on a color pack and took the famous photograph. And of course, later, there was a little internal squabble about who took Earthrise, but it was William Anders. And here's later, but this is, look at that photograph. That creates something called the overview effect. There's a book by Frank White called The Overview Effect that says, if you've been an not us looking at it, although it has a deep impact on us, but if you have ever seen the Earth in its entirety from space, which only a few people have done, you can never think of Earth in the same way again. That this doesn't just like change your understanding of the Earth, and proving it's round, by the way, but you never see, your consciousness is adjusted by this moment. And there's a long set of books about this. And what I find so amazing about it, when I first saw these photographs, this is Africa, of course, and Madagascar and the Arabian Peninsula. When I first saw it, I thought, hey, the maps are right, you know? Who knew? Because the map is taken, close to the Earth. And it turns out Africa does look like that. All right, so those are the 10. I could easily have shown 10 others, and then 10 others, and then 10 others. I tried to get a variety, but I mostly chose them because they're amazing photographs, but also because they have these backstories, which I think are tremendously fascinating. And I tried to pick each one that somehow epitomized something much larger than itself, and also just to celebrate the artistry of great photographers. So I think we can turn now, can't we? You can ask any question you want about any subject. We also have some photographs that were mentioned on the lists, and Megan has found them, I think.
Yes. So we have some in the balcony. We'll do questions in addition to suggestions. If what you've just experienced jarred something in you and you thought, oh, I wish I had written that down, we'll take a stab and see if we can find it. We'll see if Clay knows anything about it. But we'll start with one that was written down as you all came in. So I'm going to throw it until you don't feel like you have to turn around, but I'm going to throw it up to Megan on the balcony to bring up our first audience suggested photograph.
Yes, thank you so much. And hopefully you've seen a number of the ones you recommended, but this one came both on the sheets and from our online audience. And obviously this is Lyndon B. Johnson taking the oath of office with Jacqueline Kennedy in November of 1963 by Cecil Staunton.
He was official White House photographer. This was taken at Love Field in Dallas just a few hours after the assassination. I've just been writing about this because I'm writing a book on John Steinbeck and Camelot. And So I've been writing about this very moment. Mrs. Kennedy, whose husband's head exploded in her lap, refused to change her clothes. A number of people said, please, Mrs. Kennedy, go wash yourself and we can get a washcloth and wipe off. And she said, I want them to see what they have done. I want them to see what they have done. And Johnson was not going to get, this is the 1963 version of Air Force One, very much smaller, like a 707. And you can't believe how cramped this space was. I mean, this is like being in a closet. And Johnson wanted certain people there. You see Lady Bird Johnson there, and the others have all been identified, of course. And this is the judge. He was a municipal judge in Dallas in the polka dots who was brought to the field. And he wouldn't take off without taking the oath because of the continuity of the presidency. And so Mrs. Kennedy did not want to be in this photograph, but she was gently insisted that she must come. And the photograph was cropped because there are, I don't want to be too graphic, but there are gobs of brain matter on her skirt and her stockings and blood everywhere. But she refused to change because she wanted everyone to know what had happened to her husband that day. And this led to a huge squabble between the Kennedy camp and the Johnson camp. But I think Johnson did the right thing. And it was important for continuity. Let me just say this much. When there is a transfer of power in America, there needs to be that continuity of graciousness and a belief. No, seriously. We're going to do a program about this in January here in Vail, but there needs to be a continuity that the outgoing person needs to say, I'll be part of the loyal opposition, I'll help in the transition, elections matter. We need to have those continuities. And so this photograph embodies that principle. Imagine how hard it was for Jacqueline Kennedy to come out of that room. Because she, all the way back to Washington, she was in the back and she held on to the casket. She draped her body over the casket of her husband and wouldn't leave. And then she finally, they said, no, this is too important, you must come. And so it became one of the great iconic photographs of the 20th century. Let's look at another one.
Thanks, Clay. Yeah, we'll do one more, then we'll take questions in the audience, and we'll keep working through. Megan, do you have...
These are what people wrote down on their lists.
Indeed.
Right. Unrehearsed.
I'm glad you knew something about that first one, Clay.
The Walk to Paradise Garden. The Walk to Paradise Garden, W. Eugene Smith, 1946. I've never seen this photograph before. Do we know?
Did whoever wrote it down, would you like to share a story about why this was on your list?
Why this matters to you?
All right.
Here we come.
Thank you.
Wait for it. It's a beautiful photo. It's magnificently composed.
Well, I believe that W. Eugene Smith had lost his belief that he could even take photos. So for a period of time, he took no photos. And then when he decided that he would take his camera out, his grandchildren were walking on a path in front of him. And he made me noted for a documentary photo of Minyata, which was a woman holding her dying son. And he had been, some kind of poison or something had been poured on him. But this photo was taken much later.
How many of you have seen this photograph? I've never seen it. Just a handful of people have seen it. An amazing photograph. Okay, let's see if anyone in the audience has a...
Are there questions in the audience?
These do not have to be nominations. They can be questions or thoughts or comments or disagreements.
So I noticed that your top 10 are, I'll just call them American-centric. You know, the photographers, I think, are mostly American. They're American events. So I just wondered, was that purposeful? Is, you know, that for this audience, that's what you chose? Or, so I'm just curious about that.
Well, they're not only America-centric, but they're clay-centric. You know, I was born around the mid-20th century, and many of them are photographs from my own time, or they're photographs that in my formative years were very widely distributed. No, I didn't have any particular, I didn't want to emphasize America necessarily. Many of the photographs, there's an honorable mention group of about 180 photographs in my computer, no time to show them, but many of them are from all over the world. But I wanted, the backstories really are important to me. You know, you could say there's too much darkness, there's too much violence, it's too much Vietnam era. This is why any of these lists is silly. And I freely admit that, but look what the conversations we're going to be having, and I think you'll be having later. What were your 10 photographs? And I think it would be interesting if you compiled them and somehow let us know, because everyone's list is going to be slightly different. Some are, of course, universal, but not all. And so the fault is mine. I just chose photographs that I thought were extremely interesting, and but another person would choose a different set. I certainly didn't mean to be America or Eurocentric, but America has been, most of these photographers, by the way, were European-born, Halsman and Eisenstadt and Yusuf Karsh, but the photographs were largely either taken by Americans or taken in America, but it's a great point.
I sense we may have 10 photographs cocktail parties this summer in Vail.
I think we should, yes.
We've got another question here up front, and then we'll go to the next photographs.
Okay, yes.
I have three really quickly. One
Yes,
Yalta.
a little closer to your mouth.
I have three really quickly. One Yalta, two woman with the bluish green eyes on the cover of National Geographic.
So there's the mushroom cloud. Yalta, did you say? That heartbreaking photograph of FDR who was dying. And this is such an important photograph. You've seen it. Churchill, Stalin, FDR. FDR is dying, which raises a whole set of questions about naming Truman to be your vice president when it's clear that FDR was not going to live through his fourth term. There was almost no vetting of Truman. Truman turned out to be an amazing president, but it couldn't have been understood. And by the way, Truman learned of the existence of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project, the day he was inaugurated. He had been kept out of the loop. And so like 2 hours after he takes the oath, they say, oh, by the way, we have a $2 billion project to build a weapon of mass destruction. You might want to know about that, Mr. President. So that's a great photograph. And many Cold War historians say that because FDR was not 100%, that he didn't stand up to Stalin sufficiently, and this helped the Soviets build their empire in the Eastern Bloc, and that if FDR had been at the top of his game, he might have been able to push back harder on Stalin. There's the photograph, and it's in my second list. Here's what I love about this one. Taken by Steve McCurry in 1984. There she is on the left. Just a stunning, stunning photograph. They found her much, much later. That's her, with a lot of wear and tear from living in Afghanistan, holding a copy of that extraordinary cover. Of course, some of the greatest photographs of the 20th century were featured in Life, but also in National Geographic. That's an absolutely amazing photograph. So yeah, and the atomic bomb. It's hard to get a great. There are many photographs of atomic detonations. There's not a good one of Alamogordo, the test, and the ones of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are just kind of okay, but they're certainly critically important to the modern world. So good choices. Other thoughts or comments? There's one back there.
All right.
I love that. I love the one on the left, but I also love the one on the right.
Excuse me, I'm sure it's not like that. Building on your question there, in terms of American-centric, but we've also very people-centric as well. I was expecting on my list to think of an Ansel Adams work in terms of something that's so powerful and iconic, exactly, and tells a story that has been so impactful in our history.
One of the, maybe the greatest landscape photographer of all time. In this very file, I have 7 of his photographs and of the Grand Tetons and Half Dome and other Yosemite and the Grand Canyon and landscapes in the Central Valley, or actually on the eastern slope of the Sierra. Unbelievable. So nature photography has never been equaled by Ansel Adams, and certainly that any one of his greatest photographs could be in somebody's top 10 list.
Clay, could you share just a bit about the the role photography played in the conservation of the American West?
Ooh, that's a long and difficult subject, but today, when you go to the Grand Canyon or Devil's Tower or the Grand Tetons or Yosemite or Glacier or etc., you've already seen them because they're ubiquitous in documentary films and photographs and collections of books. That's a recent development. When Theodore Roosevelt went to the Grand Canyon for the first time in 1903 on a presidential tour of the West, he saw the Grand Canyon for the first time. And it was stunning because he hadn't been prepared for it. It was like coming over a hill and seeing, oh, the Grand Canyon. And it had an impact that it still has an enormous impact, but it had an impact on him that changed the world. And he said one of the greatest things on that day, this was May 6, 1903, and he's there, and they were planning to build a hotel and a railroad and the usual stuff. And he said this, and this should be the mission statement, and it should be on the welcome sign of every national park. He said, "Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." Isn't that perfect? Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. And so photographs, and also great illustrations in the pre-photographic era, helped get the population centers of the country, which were all to the east, to understand the importance of conserving these landscapes, really for the first time. And Ansel Adams certainly played a role in that. And there were writers that were doing some of the same thing, but as Megan said, a picture is worth 100,000 words. This was one I chose. Look at that photograph, the Snake River in front of the Grand Tetons. I remember seeing that when I was a boy. I grew up in North Dakota, so we did not know that there were mountains. And when you see that, you just think, first of all, what a photographer. It somehow gains by being in black and white, I think. But what an incredible place that is. And thank God for Theodore Roosevelt, because he decided that we were wrecking the West. And it was all going to be commercially developed and exploited and privatized and so on. And because of that, he was the greatest conservation president in American history. He set aside 230 million acres of the public domain as national park, national forest, national monument, national game refuge, national wildlife refuge. No president has done anything even close to that. And he didn't have the advantage of being able to show photographs like this. This would have helped persuade members of Congress to do the right thing on these questions. When Roosevelt began to propose these conservation methods, this will sound familiar to you. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Joseph Cannon of Illinois, said, and I quote, "Not 1 cent for scenery." Sound familiar? Not 1 cent for scenery. And it was only Roosevelt's incredible strength of personality that pushed some of it by executive order. And he helped to save some of the greatest things in the West. And by the way, just a shout out to the Rockefeller family. We saw the RCA building earlier. The Rockefellers saved the Grand Tetons. They bought them. And they also bought the Great Smoky Mountains. So they owned them, and they offered them free to the United States government. We'll buy them. This is our gift to America. And in both cases, the US government turned them down until they brought more money for the maintenance and the rangers and so on. Imagine, we nearly turned down the Grand Tetons because the government said, "Oh, that's just going to be another expense," which it is, of course. But if you want to talk about the top 10 national parks, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the Grand Tetons are certainly top 20 and maybe top 10. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, exactly.
We'll take another from the clipboard. Megan.
Here's a farther zoomed out nature photo.
The pale blue dot. All right, so this photograph, have you been following that Voyager 1 is kind of blinked out? There were several of them sent in the 1970s, and that's the one where you had the disc of music and iconography and calculus and greetings in a number of languages and some pop songs and country songs and Brahms symphonies. It was all Carl Sagan. He wanted to send out this record because you know all aliens have record players. And there was a huge national search to decide what goes on this record. It's a fascinating story. There's a book about it. But it went on Voyager 1. And Sagan and his second wife, Anya Droyan, were in charge of that. So Voyager 1 left the solar system. It's the American probe that's farthest away from the planet Earth. And amazingly, it's supposed to have a shelf life of about a dozen years. It continued to work until about a year ago when it started to blink out. And now, I just read yesterday, NASA is trying to send signals that might revive it. And they probably will. It's stunning. But anyway, to send a photograph like this back to the Earth from beyond Neptune is like that technology I talked about at the Dickinson Press. It goes, it's pixel by pixel by pixel. It takes like 3 days to transmit this. So there was an enormous pressure on what can we photograph, because you choose your subjects carefully. Sagan said, what if we turned it around and had it look back at the Earth? And the Jet Propulsion Laboratory people said no, because the sun is out there too, and if that lens gets too close to the sun, it'll burn out the circuitry, so no, we can't do it. And Sagan said, I just want you to do this. And because of his enormous stature, NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory allowed it, and they turned it, and then this photograph came back, and that led to his famous lectures and book called The Pale Blue Dot. That's the Earth from the edge of the solar system. And if you look at the Earthrise photograph or the overview effect photograph, you get a sense of the magnificent beauty of the Earth. Alone in the solar system, just stunning. Water, the blue, the cloud cover. But then you see this and you realize, oh my gosh, are we really the center of creation? Are we really it? This is what he says. I'm just paraphrasing, from The Tonight Show. Billions and billions and billions. This is a tiny planet in a fourth-rate solar system in a modestly small galaxy in which there are billions of other galaxies. And so Sagan said, not wanting to be provocative, and nor do I, but do you think that this is God's sole project? That here and here alone he planted his favorite being, and he sent Jesus here, but not to the other billion places? Or are there similarly flawed beings everywhere that he had to send a Jesus-like being to all of them? But it really rocks a kind of a fundamentalist cosmology. But this photograph exists because of the will of one man, of Carl Sagan. And I think that's an incredible monument to that extraordinary human being. Do a couple more. I think it's just a little bit of time.
I saw it. Yeah, you go, Greg.
We got about 10 minutes here. Hang in there.
Thank you. Clay, I'm mindful, I'll let the horse out of the barn first, of the famous Civil War photograph by Matthew Brady of the tent. How many in the first 50 years of photography, the late 19th century, how many of those photographs did you even think about or included your larger archive?
So when I thought about this, you make lists, I make endless lists. There has to be a Matthew Brady photograph, right? Because this is the first war that was really captured on film, and Brady has hundreds of photographs, and several of them, I don't know if Megan can find one on the fly, but several of them are just world-class, iconic photographs. In the end, I chose the others, but yes, he has to be in any history of the greatest photographs ever taken. And the technology then, I've been working a little with this because of Edward S. Curtis. How do you take a picture when you're Matthew Brady? You have a glass plate, you have a piece of glass, 8 by 10 inches. You have to take it into a darkened space in the field, try that, and cover it with liquid silver nitrate. And while it is still wet, you have to put it in a frame, and then you have to insert that frame in the back of a very large camera. And there's no shutter, so you pull a lens cap off, 1001, 1002, 1003. Then you put that shutter back on, you put a slide down, you pull that still wet glass plate, which now has to be developed before it dries. What can go wrong? And then that was high tech compared to daguerreotype and the earlier ones. Then comes dry glass plate. That's what Edward S. Curtis used. So you don't have to pour any chemicals. He could take a picture of Geronimo and put it in a darkened box and take it back to Seattle and develop it there. But I was a wedding photographer on a couple of occasions, and then I quit because I was having anxiety fits back in the era of film, because if you take a roll of pictures of someone's wedding and they don't turn out, they'll kill you. Today you have digital cameras, and so you're not, unless you put the SD card in your wash, and it often will survive that, I can tell you from hard experience, you're going to get those wedding pictures. But imagine, this is a Brady here, and they all have this kind of look with people in hats, but there are starker versions of that. Megan, would you pull up the Edward Curtis photograph called, it's in my system, The Vanishing Race?
Yes, give me one moment.
I just want to show you this because we're talking about camera technologies. Just give her a second.
Clay, maybe while she's pulling that up, I can offer some gratitude tonight. Jeff Fleming and Don Watson here at ERPC, Joe Kanya and Megan McGee-Bonta up there making the images happen. Dale Mosier and Chris Sable worked with Clay on the vision for tonight. This will save me having to thank all these people in just a moment, but maybe a little round of applause for the team behind the scenes.
Another way of putting that is I come up with one knuckleheaded idea after the next, and then they have to fulfill it. But I think it's I wanted to do this part of this program because several people have sort of gently rebuked me, America-centric, from my own time, lots of violence and so on. Here's the photograph, I'll talk about it in a minute. I wanted you to be able to be a corrective, and so that we together we're forming a better idea of what the parameters should be of this. This is very, very valuable, and when I give this lecture again, if I ever do, if I can find a team that would do it, because this is on the fly, picking these things up from Google Images, I will add some of the suggestions. There will be a Brady, there will be some more foreign photographs, and so on. This is Edward Curtis. He took this in 1904 in New Mexico. Dry glass plate, so he doesn't know what he's got. He takes it back to Seattle and he develops it, and it was radically underexposed. Worthless, really. Should have just broken the glass. But he and his German-born chemist in the darkroom spent a whole weekend trying to resurrect something from this photograph so that they would have something. And this is what they produced. And it's called The Vanishing Race, and it has these natives riding horses. You see one of them is looking back like Lot's wife. Curtis believed that this epitomized what was going to happen to Native Americans, that they would vanish. This was a whole myth of the time, the vanishing Indian. And this became one of his 4 or 5 most iconic photographs, and this is the one that he used to get people like J.P. Morgan to fund this project, because it is so stunning, but it's a failed photograph that was resurrected in this way. He expected it to be more like an Ansel Adams photograph where we'd see the faces and the horses and everything. But look at the beauty of this. The shadows of the horses, the sort of luminescent effect, which is, I think, a darkroom manipulation on the top of, this is Canyon de Chelly, I believe. This is, and so, how many of you have been to Canyon de Chelly? Oh my. And he took the famous Canyon de Chelly photograph too, that has the cliffs and the horses going down with a dog. But you see that he produced a masterpiece from a failed exposure, which is credit to Adolf Muir, his darkroom manager, but sheer perseverance. And then the failure of the photograph reinforced his theme of the shadow that's engulfing the native world and so on. Now we know that that was a myth that even could be called a racist myth, but it was a very widely held myth. Roosevelt felt that. James Earl Fraser felt that. You've probably seen the iconic statue by James Earl Fraser of the end of the trail of the Native American slumped over his horse. one of the most widely reproduced images in America. And this photograph contributed to it and was one of the lead photographs in Edward S. Curtis's work. So let's do one more and then we'll quit.
Okay, Megan, one more from the clipboard.
There's a question. Let's take the live person back there.
Oh, here we go. I'm coming.
Thank you. This has been really compelling. I'm just wondering, I guess you were asking about what seemed like it might be missing. And because it's so American-centric, for me, to me seems absent is something that portrays the civil rights movement. You know, whether it's Gordon Parks and one of those seminal images, or something of MLK or Selma, or
I'll tell you one.
To me, I'm missing that.
Again, another extremely important photo. Megan, if you can find a photograph called, it's taken in Memphis. It's called I Am a Man. It's a photograph of a number of African Americans holding up signs, and if you can just find it, absolutely. So in other words, I said at the beginning, I hope you remember, this is arbitrary, and I'm an idiot. So and I appreciate your suggestions because, of course, Marilyn Monroe is a celebrity, but is that the best photograph to depict women in America? She comes up a couple of times here. Even though the photographers are largely foreign, there is an American-centric view because photojournalism has been historically stronger in America than other places, partly because of we were pioneers in newspaper print photography and the kind of printing that led to the glories of Life magazine and so on. But there's certainly a European, someone from, say, Germany picking the 10 greatest photographs would probably not pick this. I mean, it seems to me that in my second list I had a picture of Buchenwald taken by Margaret Bork-White, and it's a horrendous, appalling, important photograph. And if you'll just agree to take a short break, we'll spend here till midnight, and I'll go through all the other. So, Megan, can you find that? Are you finding that? Hang on, here, it's going to come here in a second. But it's this. This is the photograph I would have chosen. I can't stand. Look at that. Look at that. I first saw this at the airport in Memphis when I was passing through. And look, this is the garbage man strike that precipitated the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1968. And these African American garbage men had to put on signs to say, I am a man. Do you get it? I am a man. I deserve to be treated with human respect and dignity. And look at the National Guard and the tanks, and it's just a heartbreaking photograph to think that this was a moment in American history, 1968. And here's the more heartbreaking thing. In some quarters of this country, this fight is still ongoing, as we saw beginning in 2008 with the election of the first African American president of the United States. But the Bettis Bridge, of course the most famous of these photographs is the dogs and the clubbing of protesters on the streets of Selma, Alabama. Yes, civil rights has to be part of this. Native America has to be part of this. And also, I like, the photograph of the two children in the woods. Some upbeat photographs would be kind of fun too, but the ones that tend to achieve, sort of go viral in a huge way, are the photographs of moments. So let's just end with, can you go to Kent State, the picture of Mary Ann Vecchio? Then we'll stop, and you can linger and we can talk privately. I apologize if I've offended any of you with my omissions. I really, really, really appreciate your suggestions, and they will be taken very seriously if and when I have the chance to do this again. So we'll close with this, and it'll come up. It was in my list of the first on the alternative list. I don't know, I'm sure he's identifiable. I don't know who he is, but bravo. Bravo, white man. And these National Guardsmen are probably here to protect these men, if that's protection. I mean, they're not attacking them. They're preventing the white racists of Memphis from attacking them. Martin Luther King was there and he gave that great speech, I may not get to the mountain, I may not see it, and just the night before all this happened, there's a photograph of the Lorraine Motel, you've seen it, where Jesse Jackson and others are looking across the street to see where that shot came from. There it is. This is the first photograph that rocked my world. May 4th, 1970, Kent State, 4 killed, 4 dead in Ohio, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And here's quickly the story. This is Jeffrey Miller, who was one of the 4 killed. 13 seconds of fire by American National Guardsmen from Ohio. 2 of the people killed were students just walking to class. They had nothing to do with the anti-Vietnam protests. She is a homeless girl. She's 14, if you can imagine that. She's 14. She's from Florida. She ran away from home. She's drifting around the country, has no money, often barefoot, had just been given a pair of shoes earlier that day. She doesn't think she's in a protest zone. She happens onto this campus. This happens, and there was a photographer from the student newspaper at Kent State named John Philo, and he had 2 frames left in his black and white 35 millimeter film, and he was trying to figure out, how do you take a picture of this? How do you take a picture of this scene? Because the 4 who were killed were scattered all over this campus, this sort of mall in the campus, and she was there, and he saw this. He saw her, and she was leaning down to try to see if he was alive and if she could help him. And then he saw her horror and her rage and her sorrow building, and he thinks something's going to happen here. And then when she went into this gesture of agony, snapped the photograph. He won a Pulitzer Prize. She's still alive. She's had a rough life. She's still alive, and she has, in the last 15 years, has agreed to a few interviews. She's very private, and she did not want to be an icon, of course. Today, imagine, with CNN and Fox and MSNBC, and we don't even want to think of any of these photographs being taken right now. But in a photography class, this would get a C, because look, there's a stake growing out of her head. The first thing you're told when you take pictures is make sure there's not something growing out of their head. But he didn't have time to say, would you move a little, or let me rearrange the shot. But this became the rallying cry of Kent State. Richard Nixon said the National Guard were right. The governor of Ohio said the students had it coming. Public opinion in America was 69% on the side of the National Guard. But this photograph turned things around. And then you remember James Michener, who wrote all those 2,000-page books. He was commissioned by his publisher to go to Kent State, to go to Kent, Ohio, and write a book about it. And the book is called Kent State, What Happened and Why. And my father, who was this lovely intellectual in this cattle town in western North Dakota, a banker, he subscribed to the New Yorker, the only person in Jenkinson, North Dakota who subscribed to the... No, truly. And he heard about this book and he ordered it. And ordering a book back then was not a simple thing. And when he got it, he read it and he said to me, you must read this book. You must read this book. And so I did, and it sort of radicalized me. And Michener said, this is the girl with the Delacroix face, if you've ever seen paintings by Delacroix of the horrors of the French Revolution and so on. He called her the girl with the Delacroix face, and it became the icon of that phase. This is the secret and unauthorized invasion of Cambodia in May of 1970. And so she just happened to be here, and the photographer just happened to be here, and the gesture epitomizes the horror that we all feel, whatever your politics are, of this moment when, and I'll just close with this. First of all, thank you for coming, and to those who are streaming, thank you. And if you have other suggestions, I want them. I'm listening hard. This was just meant to be a conversation starter, one person's list of 10, but these photographs invite conversation, and they reveal things deeper than themselves. And when we think about 1968, one of the worst years in modern American history, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the catastrophic Democratic National Convention, the Tet Offensive, 1968, and then 1969. When we think we're in a very, very, very critical moment right now, and we are, it's worth remembering those 2 years were regarded as the disintegration of America. We got through it. We came back together. We largely repaired. A historian looking at this would say, don't be too presentist. We will get through this thing, we hope. And better times are coming, but these come in cycles, and that was one of the worst of them right there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Clay.
Thank you.
And I'll bring us back around full circle quickly. When I was looking up this photo, when it was suggested, this photographer, W. Eugene Smith, spent his entire career as a war photographer,
Oh my.
highlighting social justice and war atrocities. But he wanted one photo that highlighted the opposite of war. And he caught his 2 kids walking hand in hand and took this one. And this is the one he's best known for.
And that's something, yeah.
Here, here. Ladies
So-
and gentlemen, Clay Jenkinson.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.